Hello everyone, in this video I'll be showing you a battle between chess.com and Lichess bots. First of all, White is the Komodo chess.com bot and he's on level 25 and its rating is 3200, which is very impressive. On the black side is Stockfish level 8 from Lichess and his rating is only 3000. So let's see how this game goes. Pawn to d4. This is the queen's pawn opening. Stockfish responds with pawn to d5. Knight to f3. Knight to f6. This is symmetrical. Pawn to c4, busting in the center. Stockfish declines the gambit. Pawn to g3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop. Pawn to c5, busting open. Have you ever seen a type of position? Okay, maybe you have seen a type of position, but this is pure like busting open. Now, pawn takes d5, pawn takes d4, bishop to g2, not even taking the pawn or not even taking the opponent's pawn, just bishop to g2. Okay, black plays queen to a5 check. Knight to d2 blocks the check, and now the queen takes the pawn on d5. So now Stockfish is up 1 point of material. White castles. Black plays pawn to e5, gaining more space and solidifying the center. Knight to knight to g5, basically doing nothing, advancing the knight, I guess. Queen, queen to b5. I think Stockfish was trying to pressure the pawns. Pawn to a4, gaining space and attacking the black queen. Queen moves one square down, queen to b6. Queen to c2, knight to c6. Queen to c4. Knight goes back to d8. Pawn to a5, aggressively attacking the queen again. Queen to c5, offering a trade of queens. Pawn to a6. Rook to b8, which defends the pawn but doesn't take. Uh, Queen to d3. Now the knight and queen are attacking this pawn, but this pawn is also defended by the black knight. So, pawn takes a6, knight to c4. Stockfish attacks the white knight with pawn to h6, and knight goes to e4. Knight takes e4, and queen takes e4. That hangs a knight. But Stockfish decides not to take it with rook to b5. Queen back to d3, defending the knight. Bishop to e7. Knight to a3. Rook back to b8. Bishop to d2. Bishop to b7, challenging the white bishop. Rook to c1, attacking the queen. Queen goes back to d6. Knight to c4, attacking the queen. Queen goes to e6. Bishop takes b7. Knight takes b7. Knight takes e5, again hanging a knight for some reason. But Stockfish decides to attack the queen instead. Queen to f3. Now the white knight is still hanging, but Stockfish decides to play knight to b3. Komodo attacks the black rook with knight to c6. Stockfish takes the white rook on c1. Komodo recaptures the knight instead of taking his own rook. Rook to c8. Knight takes d4. Rook takes c1 check. Bishop takes c1. Queen to c1, attacking the bishop. Bishop moves back to d2. Black finally castles. Knight to f5. And queen to e6. Bishop to c3. Bishop to f6, attacking the bishop. Now Komodo plays a very nice move, which is knight takes h6. Now you understand, if the pawn takes, then this bishop will be attacked by the queen and the white bishop, but it will only be defended by the black queen. So instead of taking, Stockfish plays king to h7. Now the knight moves back to f5. Bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, and now Stockfish advances its a6 pawn to a5. Now knight to d4, attacking the black queen, queen to b6, queen to e4 check, pawn to g6 blocking the check, knight to f3, queen to c5, king to g2. Now notice that it hangs a pawn. But Stockfish decides not to take it and plays king to g7. Now pawn to h4, rook to b8, pawn to h5, planning to bust everything open around the black king. Pawn takes, Stockfish calls Komodo's bluff. Knight to d4, pawn to a4, queen to f4, rook to rook to b6. Now knight to f5 check, king to f8, and pawn to e4. Rook to b2, king goes to h3, king to e8, and queen to g5. Now look, the black king is in the midst of attack, and although Stockfish is up 2 points of material, it doesn't seem that good for black. But Stockfish decides to get his king out of trouble by king to d7. Komodo regains one pawn. King back to c8. Komodo regains his second pawn, and now the material is equal. But the engine, which is Stockfish 12, says that black is still winning by a lot because of this passed pawn. Now, Stockfish advances his passed pawn to a3. Komodo does the same by advancing his pawn to c4. Stockfish plays king to b8, queen to g8 check, king to b7, queen to g7 check, king goes to a6, and pawn to f3. Now, Stockfish moves his rook to b3 to attack this pawn, this pawn. Yeah. Uh, Komodo plays queen to f6 with check, king moves to a5, and now queen to d8 check. King moves back to a6, queen to f6 check again. Now, if this position repeats one more time, it would be a draw by repetition. But Stockfish blocks the check with his queen. Now, white could trade queens, but this passed pawn is too dangerous, so white decides not to. Queen to a1, blocking the pawn, and yeah. Rook to d3, king to g4, and queen to b2. Now, offering a trade of queens, of course, the trade of queens would be suicide for white because the passed pawn would be unstoppable. So, white plays queen to f1, queen to c3 by black, queen to b1, queen takes c4, Stockfish gains a pawn, uh, queen to a1, blocking black's pawn again, but pawn to a2, advancing, knight to e7, rerouting the knight. Now king to b5, knight to g6, queen to e6 check, and now Komodo gives up his knight. So queen takes knight, queen to b2 check, king to c5, queen takes the Pawn on a2. Black has lost his passed pawn, but black first checks the white king. Queen to h6 check. King moves to g4. Queen to g7 check. King moves back to h4, and now black takes the pawn. Queen to d5 check. King to b4. Queen to d2 check. And rook blocks the check with rook to c3. Now white advances his g pawn with pawn to g4. Queen to h8 check. King to g5. Queen to e5 check. King to g6. Now queen takes e4 check. King to h5. Queen to e5 with check again. King moves to g6, and now the black king moves out of his pin. Sorry, the black king makes the rook move out of the pin. Sorry, the black king just moves out of the way with king to a3. Queen to d7, and black advances his pawn with pawn to a5. White does the same with pawn to g5, and now rook to g3, threatening to sacrifice everything. Now queen to f5. This is literally white has literally resigned. Now queen takes f5 and king takes f5. Now what black can do? Black can even sacrifice his rook like this, and after king takes, just king moves out of the way and push a pawn. But instead, Stockfish goes for a bit more um, keeping his material strategy. King to f4, rook to g1, and now Komodo just gives up his last pawn with pawn to g6, and Stockfish takes it gladly. Now king to e4, pawn advances, king to f5 attacking the rook, rook moves to g1, king to e4 again, pawn advances, king to e5, white is just shuffling around, pawn advances again, king to f5, and the black pawn finally turns into a queen. The game is officially over for white if you haven't noticed. Now king to e6, rook to g5 check. Sorry, rook to g5, cutting off the king from this file. Now king moves to e7, queen to e5 check, king to f8, and now queen to c7 beautifully cuts of the king from this file. The king cannot move here because the rook is targeting the square, and after the king makes his next move, Stockfish beautifully delivers checkmate. Now this game should be an example because even though Komodo's rating was 3200 and Stockfish's rating was 3000, Stockfish still won. And so that is what you have to learn from this game, that rating doesn't always matter. Now I will be posting a few more videos about more games from this chess computers, Lichess versus chess.com. So stay tuned and like and subscribe this video. Sorry, like this video and subscribe to my channel if you end up enjoying this video. So thank